Hey everyone, this is Andrew Ty and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be comparing the relative gaming performance of the original M1 chip against the M1 Pro and the M1 Max chips. So this video is a follow-up to a video that I produced last week. However, this time I'll be covering different games and I'll also be offering my thoughts about which M1 is going to be the best for gaming. So in this video, I'll be comparing the performance of the base M1 chip. So this is the MacBook Air 13-inch with 8 CPU cores, 8GB of RAM, and also 8 GPU cores too. This is different from the base MacBook Air 13-inch, which only has 7 GPU cores. Next up is the base 14-inch M1 Pro with 8 CPU cores, 16GB of RAM, and 14 GPU cores. The next one will be the base 16-inch M1 Pro with 10 CPU cores, 16GB of RAM, and 16 GPU cores. And finally, we have the MacBook Pro 16-inch with the M1 Max chip. So this has 10 CPU cores, 32GB of RAM, and 32 GPU cores. So the first game we're going to be looking at is Hitman. So this is the version of the game released in 2016. It is the first of the modern trilogy, and is the only one of this modern trilogy which has a Mac port. So in this benchmark video, I'm running this at 1080p, and I'm going to be setting all of the graphics levels up to the highest. So in terms of performance difference between each of the new MacBooks, you'll actually find that different scenes will produce different levels of relative performance. So for example, in this outdoor helicopter scene, there is a huge difference between the M1 and the M1 Pro chips of more than double the amount of frames. However, there is not as much a substantial difference between the M1 Pros and then the M1 Max, which is in the bottom right hand corner. However, once we hit a scene where we have hundreds of characters on screen at once, we can really see where the benefits of the M1 Max's GPU come into play, and there's a more stark difference between the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. So Hitman is the type of game with lots of varied environments. So there are large exterior areas, there are very large interior areas with houses with multiple rooms. We have rooms with hundreds of NPCs all interacting with each other. We can also get lots of strange camera angles, including things like CCTV shots. So whichever Mac that you choose to play this game on, just be aware that it has to be able to handle all of these different kinds of environments. However, I would say that the base M1 MacBook Air can actually play this game very well. All we need to do is to crank down the detail settings and we're going to have a playable frame rate. However, it's obviously going to be much better on the M1 Pro, on the M1 Max chips, which can hit 60 plus frames per second even at the highest ultra settings. So here are the average frame rates produced by the benchmark. So you can see that the M1 Max has around 4 times the number of frames as the original M1. However, what's notable here is that the base M1 Pro is nearly 3 times faster than the base M1, and it's much closer to the M1 Max performance. And also that there is less than 10% difference between the base and the mid-tier M1 Pro machines. So next up is the game Borderlands 3. So I'm going to be running this at 1080p at medium settings. So I run this at medium because the MacBook Air can't quite keep up. However, I'd like to be able to compare them all side by side, so I put them at a medium setting this time. So Borderlands 3 is one of the more recent macOS ports. However, it's kind of notorious because it was not ported very well and it has relatively poor performance compared to other games which have similar styles and graphical fidelity. So for example, in this scene, there's very little difference between the M1 Pros and the M1 Max chip, despite the fact that the M1 Max has more than double the amount of GPU cores. When we get to an actual scene with proper combat and fighting with NPC characters, we'll see a relatively small difference between the original M1 chip and then the M1 Max, of only around 50% increase. So this game is not really optimized for the type of chips that we have, which is a real shame because this definitely could have been one of the best looking games on the M1 Pro and the M1 Max chips. So here we have the averaged out benchmark. So the original M1 gets 29 FPS, the base 14-inch M1 Pro gets 42 FPS, the mid-tier M1 Pro gets 46 FPS, and the M1 Max gets 55 FPS. So these are substantial differences between the original M1 and the M1 Max, but much less of a difference between both of the M1 Pros and the M1 Max chip, which is a shame because there's such a big price differential between them. So next up is the real-time strategy game Company of Heroes 2. So I'm again running this at 1080p and I'm turning up all of these settings to the highest. So this is a little bit of an older game, so we can afford to pump this up as high as we can. So compared to most strategy games, Company of Heroes 2 is very tactical, so it's really focused on individual units or squads and how they all interact with each other. There's a lot of physics elements as well, with explosions and tanks rolling over objects, etc. So there's a lot to compute in these scenes. If we take the base M1 as the 1.0 performance measure, then we're getting nearly double for the M1 Pros and about triple for the M1 Max chip too. So this is a little bit disappointing that the M1 Max can't reach its potential in this particular game, especially given that this game was originally released in 2013. So this is all confirmed in the average frame rates calculated by the benchmark. The M1 Max's average FPS of 70 does not quite scale up over the M1 Pro's average of 52 and 56 FPS. So next up is Dirt Rally. So this game was released in 2015 and is one of the few racing games that you can play on the Mac operating system. It performs surprisingly well even on the base M1 chip. I'm running this at 900p due to a monitor issue, and I've got all the settings turned up to Ultra. So right off the bat, the original M1 Air is getting excellent frame rates, hovering around 60 frames per second, which is really excellent for this type of game, especially how well optimized it is, especially for the graphical quality that it offers. The M1 Pros are offering roughly 80 to 100% increase in speed, and the M1 Max is only around 18-19% faster than the base 14-inch M1 Pro, which is surprising given that the M1 Max is supposed to be so much faster, especially in terms of graphical fidelity, due to its additional GPU cores. So again, what's notable here is that the base M1 Pro is getting 119 FPS, whereas the mid-tier M1 Pro is getting 124 FPS. So the last game we'll be covering today is Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. So I'm running this at 1080p and I've turned up all of these settings to Ultra. So this game never had a good reputation as a macOS port, and unfortunately it's very unoptimized even with the power of the M1 chip. Here the game is barely reaching a consistent 60 frames per second even on the M1 Max chip. It really depends on what the camera is looking at. This game is capable of rendering some really large open-ended environments, however the frame rate will tank if you're in certain situations. So here the average frame rate of the M1 Max is 39.89 FPS, and this is not necessarily that much higher than the base M1 Pro. So what I've done is put together all of this information into a chart, so you can directly compare all of the M1 Apple Silicon Macs that I have available. So out of this lineup, we are missing the 24-core M1 Max. We're also missing the M1 Max with 64 gigabytes of RAM. However, given the data that we have at the moment, I think we can figure out roughly what kind of performance we're going to receive with those configurations. After using the new M1 chips for over a week now, I think that the basic conclusion that I'm going to draw is that the M1 Pro is a real substantial upgrade over the original base M1. And in terms of gaming performance, we're looking around double in almost every situation. This isn't to say that the original M1 is bad, however, if you're looking for an upgrade in performance, the base M1 Pro is really the way to go. What has impressed me much less is the mid-tier M1 Pros with 2 additional CPU cores and 2 additional GPU cores. This is because it doesn't seem like it translates into real-world performance. So for example, the 14-inch M1 Pro base model is $2,000, and if we want to upgrade to the 10-core 16 GPU model, we need to add $300, which is an increase of 15%. However, in the gaming performance benchmarks that I've been showing you, we're often getting less than 10% increase in performance. Similarly, if I spec out the 14-inch with the M1 Max chip, then we're actually increasing our cost to $3,099, and this is an increase of a whopping 55%. However, in some games like Shadow of Mordor, we're only receiving around 18% increase in frame rate. So therefore it feels like the base 14-inch M1 Pro is going to hit that sweet spot in terms of price and performance. So I do feel like the base M1 Pro is going to suit most people, especially if they want to play the occasional game. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more benchmark videos where I compare all of the Apple Silicon Macs that I have, then please check out the video in the description. I compare games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider as well as games like Deus Ex: Mankind Divided. If you have any requests for other games to benchmark, please leave a comment. If you liked the video, please like, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.